Members of the Council, guests, and friends, on behalf of the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs and the World Trade Center Institute, I would like to welcome you to this evening's program. Let me announce that our next two meetings will be with Cesar Italia, the Ambassador of Peru to the United States, on Thursday, May 19th in this room, and on the 24th of May we'll meet with Ambassador Alan Woods, who is the administrator or head of the Agency for International Development. Our session today, of course, has as its topic the United States and the world economy, a topic which doesn't always conjure up happy thoughts. Trade deficits, balance of payment problems, our debtor status, private sector loans, difficulty of competing in world markets, and numerous other items are at times discouraging. And to deal with this particular topic, we're very fortunate indeed to have a very distinguished scholar and our present United States Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs. Secretary, and let me indeed give a very, very short summary of his resume, which describes a very long and distinguished academic career. And I should note, and I hope I don't get too far, don't intrude into his introduction, but his father was a Rhodes Scholar from the state of Maryland, the third Rhodes Scholar in our state's history, which is an item which I'm sure he would have been too modest to mention, so therefore I put it before you. The Secretary is a graduate of the University of Minnesota. He did graduate work in economics and statistics at the Universities of Minnesota, Chicago, and Columbia. Following that, he taught at Yale, Stanford, Columbia, Chicago, and Rochester. He served as the Dean of the Graduate School of Business at the University of Chicago from 1956 to 1962. He also did some work immediately after, in the early stage of his career with the New Deal. He did stints at the National Bureau of Economic Research, the Ford Foundation, and the Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences. He's published extensively in economics, public policy, and in higher education. He's been a research economist in the government. He served as special assistant to President Eisenhower in 1959 to 61. He's been on 8 presidential commissions, chairing 4 of them during the Nixon, Ford, and Carter years. And he was chancellor of the University of Rochester from 1962 to 1982. At that time, he was appointed to his present position as Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs. I mentioned the position through which he represents the President at the annual economic summits. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to present to you Secretary Wallis.
Thank you very much, Frank. Appreciate that introduction very much. My first visit to Baltimore was 73 years ago. My father's family, as you may guess, lived in Maryland. They farmed in Harford County for something like 200 years up until the Second World War, until shortly after the Second World War. And of course, I spent the summers there on farms in 1915 and 27 and 30, and we made numerous visits to Baltimore, which I always enjoyed, so I appreciated very much the opportunity to come back again. The city has changed, I must say.
Over 20 years.
This is a leap year, and the United States Constitution ensures that every leap year will be a time of great confusion in discussing economic policy. With the political season comes silliness and slogans and buzzwords that masquerade as thought, claims, charges, statistics fly about like hornets. But in spite of that, the debate on economic policy is a sign of a healthy, dynamic society. Static economies with structures that are fixed by tradition or by authority don't have much debate about economic policy. change is not necessarily healthy, but healthy economic progress necessarily brings change, and change in turn brings debate about whether to resist it, or about what changes to make, and about how to adjust to the changes. An economy like ours in the United States, which is open to international markets, experiences more pressures for change than does a closed economy. And thus, with growing integration of the world economy, economic issues in the United States increasingly relate to our place in the world economy, and that's my topic for this afternoon. Now, the issues behind the rhetoric are real, and they're important. Is our economy thriving, or is it slumping? Is our prosperity soundly based, or are we teetering on the brink of economic disaster? And are we competitive internationally, or are we being overwhelmed by more efficient producers abroad? Do we benefit from foreign trade, or are we merely weak prey for foreigners who take advantage of us? And do our economic policies need a change of direction? Should we raise taxes, intervene in markets, counterattack against foreign predators? In this year of decision, the American electorate has to sort out those questions and must separate fact from myth and reason from fallacy. The fundamental question underlying these policy debates is this: will our economy benefit if we continue in the direction of the past decade or so, increasing our reliance on markets rather than government fiat to make basic economic choices? Or would we do better to rely more directly on the government and less on private decision-making? An informed choice between those alternatives requires that we look both inward and outward. We should examine our own experience during the past several years. How successful have we been, particularly in relation to the rest of the world? But also we should note how the world is changing, and in particular how economic policies around the world are evolving. Now, the observations that follow are based partly on my experience as the President's personal representative for preparing and attending 6 economic summits. So he represents himself at those summits. I participate in preparing them, but he's a participant. And they're based partly on engaging in a large number of negotiations and discussions with officials and businessmen from many countries, and partly on participating in innumerable international organizations and conferences. Now, during the nearly 6 years that I've been in my present position, I have observed a remarkable transformation of attitudes on economic policies. Market-oriented policies that once were dismissed as old-fashioned, naive, impractical, are now seen to work in practice, and there is a major trend towards such policies throughout the world. Back in 1981, when President Reagan attended his first economic summit with the leaders of the other 6 major industrialized countries, he was preaching the benefits of free and open markets to an audience that, except for Margaret Thatcher, was skeptical, to put it mildly. They were derisive and hostile, to put it more accurately. But next month, at the Toronto summit, Francois Mitterrand will be the only remaining socialist, and even he has moved a long, long way since 1983 from the disastrous policies he introduced in 1981. Many of the poorer countries of the world have long been afflicted by statist, inward-looking, authoritarian economic policies, sometimes rooted in resentment of a colonial past, but more often rooted in Marxist ideology. Increasingly, however, many of these countries, and notably in Africa, are coming to realize that such policies lead only to continued stagnation and poverty, and they are embarking on fundamental economic reforms. Even in Latin America, where the intellectual climate has long been dominated by statism, opinion has been shifted by overwhelming evidence, and policies are changing. We see movement toward the market even in communist countries, including Russia and China. Well, what is the evidence that has created that profound shift in attitudes? Let me review some of it for you in broad terms. First, there's the comparison between the United States and Europe. During most of the post-war period, European economic growth outstripped that of the United States. In the 2 decades, 1961 to 80, for example, annual growth in the European community averaged about half a percentage point above that in the U.S. However, since the 1981-82 recession ended, the relationship has been reversed. U.S. economic growth has been consistently more robust than European, averaging during the last 5 years about 2/3 higher, and is about 1.5 percentage points higher. Similarly, creation of jobs in the United States has been strong, over 15 million increase in employment since '82, while in the European community it has been weak or non-existent, and unemployment has been stuck at for more than 5 years at a level double our present rate. Increasingly, the reason for these differences is becoming understood even by the Europeans themselves. In the United States, we have lowered important tax rates and deregulated such important sectors of the economy as transportation and communication. Markets for goods and labor are relatively open and flexible. In Europe, in contrast, governments have intervened in ways that impede adjustments to change. Labor markets in particular have been made inflexible and stagnant by social programs and regulations that were intended to improve economic security, but actually have done the opposite by creating disincentives for both workers and employers. Within Europe, the United Kingdom, which leads other European countries in the adoption of free market policies, has had a better growth record in the 1980s than its partners, and since the middle of last year, its unemployment rate has been dropping sharply. Or another bit of the evidence comes from comparing East Asia and Latin America. Consider the leading so-called newly industrializing countries, or NICs for short. 4 economies in the Far East, Hong Kong, Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan, have economic strategies that, while differing considerably from each other, are generally speaking outward-looking and market-oriented. During the past 20 years, they have attained some of the world's highest growth rates. Korea and Singapore, for example, have averaged over 9% per year for 20 years. Even during the 1980s, when external conditions were less favorable and developing countries as a whole suffered a sharp retardation in growth, those economies proved resilient and continued to progress remarkably. Latin America's main NICs are Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina. Mexico, and particularly Brazil, with aggressive export promotion, did fairly well under favorable conditions in the 70s. But their government-dominated economies with price and wage controls and highly protected and inefficient state-owned enterprises proved unable to cope with the changed conditions of the 80s. Their debts skyrocketed and their growth rates collapsed. Argentina, with the most protectionist, inward-looking policies of the group, went from sluggish growth before 1980 to actual decline since then. Now, several countries in both regions have now joined the trend toward market-oriented reform and are reaping benefits. In East Asia, for example, Malaysia and Thailand are regarded as the most likely new NICs. Thailand, following recent stabilization and liberalization measures, has emerged from a period of sluggishness and is now growing at a strong pace. In the Philippines, President Aquino's government has undertaken economic reforms and economic growth has resumed. In Latin America, Chile, afflicted in the early 80s by heavy debt and falling export prices, has rebounded strongly since 1983 with healthy growth supported by strongly market-oriented policies. Colombia is another country where sound economic policies are paying off in improved growth and easing of debt pressures. Mexico is benefiting from an ambitious economic reform program, notably in trade liberalization. And Argentina's leaders are struggling to reverse the heritage of decades of statist policies and the resultant stagnation. And there are other examples. Now, Africa is the continent with the most profound economic problems. and it has seen in recent years perhaps the most dramatic reversal of policies. During the 60s and 70s, economic policies in Africa were dominated by Marxist ideology with large public sectors, subsidies, controls on prices and exchange rates, and many other measures that protected industry and eroded incentives to produce, especially in agriculture. Now, economic decline forced the authorities to recognize that their policies were leading to destitution. A gradual but widespread process of reform is now getting underway, sometimes fitfully, but nevertheless getting underway. Perhaps 2/3 of sub-Saharan Africa countries have undertaken economic reform in the past few years, and they're supported by the IMF and the World Bank and by various bilateral programs. The United States is taking an active role in helping to mobilize that support. Progress has been uneven because of extreme poverty, heavy debts, and weak export prices. The road ahead is going to be difficult for them. But with outside help, there is hope that these countries can succeed, although not unless economic reforms are carried through. Well, again, look at the United States experience. Although the performance of the United States economy has had a profound effect on the whole world, and the economy here is performing about as well as it ever has, our policies are coming under heavy criticism at home. While much, if not most, of the criticism is politically motivated, this being leap year, some of it deserves serious consideration, and even some of that that's politically motivated merits consideration. Some argue that our strong performance in growth, employment, and price stability is hiding fundamental flaws. That's a hypothetical possibility. For example, recently Brazil had a great spurt under the Cruzeiro plan, only to collapse into worse troubles than those that had led them to adopt the Cruzeiro plan. But it's definitely not a reality in the United States. The Cruzeiro plan was obviously unsound from the beginning, and no competent economist that I've ever heard of had any uncertainty about that. Now, in 1981, the administration here supported a firm disinflationary policy of the Federal Reserve, and it shifted the focus of policy toward medium-term goals and away from the short-term fine-tuning, which experience had proved to be counterproductive. The administration worked to gain control over excessive federal spending, to curtail the growth of the government, and to encourage healthy growth in the private sector. The centerpiece of that effort was strengthening incentives to the private sector through lower income tax rates and tax reform, while reducing structural rigidities through deregulation and keeping markets open to competition. The program has not been successful in balancing federal receipts and expenditures. I'll say more about that later, but its positive accomplishments have been impressive. What do the facts tell us about the results? What is it that impresses other countries so greatly that they are abandoning views that they have believed in deeply for half a century or more and are shifting in our direction? Well, to answer that, start with the standard indexes of economic performance. The inflation rate came down from more than 12% during 79 and 80 to less than 4% by 82, and it's since been contained at just about that level through 5.5 years of economic expansion. And since the recession that inevitably follows disinflation ended in late in 1982, real growth, that is growth above inflation, has averaged a strong 4.1% per year, and we have now surpassed by about 6 months the previous U.S. record for the longest period of uninterrupted economic growth in peacetime. The economy appears to have weathered well the shock of the October stock market crash, and it looks stronger now than it did a few months ago. And as I noted earlier, employment has risen by over 15 million during the expansion, and the unemployment rate is now the lowest in 14 years. The proportion of the population employed has been continually setting new records during the last 3 years. Well, what are the flaws in that performance? Some say that prosperity has been at the expense of the poor, who have not benefited from economic expansion. But in fact, real cash income rose between 1981 and 1986 for every income group. The number of persons below the poverty level dropped by about 3 million between 83 and 86, a turnaround from a sharp upward trend that had begun in 1980. The 1987 data are not yet available, but almost certainly will show a further improvement. Now, moreover, those data are very poor data. They don't include cash payments, which make up the bulk of the relief for the poor, and they don't include income support. They do include cash payments, and they don't include income support in kind, which has been growing very rapidly. And finally, the tax reform legislation of 1986 frees 4.3 million low-income families and individuals from federal income taxes altogether. Now, some have said that the new jobs being created are typically inferior jobs, turning us into a nation of hamburger flippers. The data contradict that. Job growth has been most rapid in higher-paying, skilled occupations. The share of total full-time employment accounted for by the lowest-paying occupations has declined. Some of the misunderstanding on that point arises from the fact that wages in manufacturing are higher on average than wages in services. It's thought, therefore, that the increase in the proportion of people working in services must result in lower average wages. But that doesn't follow at all. There is a lot of variation within sectors. Service industries, for example, communication, transportation, law, medicine, engineering, education, accounting, journalism, acting, government, and others, provide many high-quality, high-paying, technology-intensive jobs, and that's where much of the growth has been. Now, some complain that our manufacturing sector is languishing, losing out to foreign competition. That certainly is true of some manufacturing firms and even of a few industries, but certainly it is not even remotely true for manufacturing as a whole. U.S. manufacturing output is up about 40% from a decade ago, and the share of manufacturing in total U.S. output is about the same as it has been for 30 years or more. Manufacturing share of employment has indeed declined, though the actual number of people employed is now climbing back toward the historical high. The decline in the proportion of employment in manufacturing, far from reflecting failure, is a consequence of success in raising productivity. Manufacturing contributes the same proportion of total output as it always has, but it does so with a far smaller proportion of total employment. Now, of course, what is true of the whole may not be true of each individual sector. In global markets, the production of particular products will shift internationally as comparative advantage shifts. And thus, for example, the textile industry in the United States suffers not so much from textile imports as from competition for its labor, capital, and management by other industries whose products cannot be produced as advantageously abroad as textiles can. While those who own fixed equipment or have skills that are not transferable may suffer from that competition, in general, workers benefit and the country benefits. While some industries are moving abroad as the pattern of efficient international specialization changes, other industries are replacing them. Indeed, in a sense, new industries push old ones abroad by bidding up the costs of their labor, capital, management, and raw materials. In other words, by raising incomes. Now, with strengthened incentives to invest, and under the stimulus provided by foreign competition, the growth of productivity in manufacturing has been particularly impressive during the period 1981 to 87. It has risen nearly 3 times as fast as during the period 73 to 81. And those dates are picked because they're cyclical peaks. Manufacturing has the benefit now of the lower value of the dollar, which makes our products cheaper in terms of marks, pounds, francs, or yen. And the volume of our non-agricultural exports rose 12% last year, even in the face of sluggish growth in some important markets, which kept their demand down. And we expect more and better performance in 88. Well, what about the huge and persistent trade and budget deficits? U.S. trade trade and current account deficits are often portrayed as the Achilles heel of U.S. policies, reflecting either weak trade policy or imprudent fiscal policy, that is the federal budget deficit. Many believe that these twin deficits pose grave threats to our future prosperity. In fact, any threat from the trade deficit is far less serious than the danger of harmful policies to deal with it, such as the omnibus trade bill now in the Congress. Among the many fallacies often perpetrated in discussing the trade deficit, 4 are especially egregious, and I want to comment on each of them. Fallacy number 1 is that the U.S. has lost fundamental competitiveness, particularly in manufacturing, so we need a more active government role in planning and coordinating research, development, investment, finance, and marketing, buttressed by temporary subsidies or barriers to imports in order to preserve our manufacturing sector. Now, I've described earlier the way in which the manufacturing industry has responded to international competitive pressures. Do we really think that government officials would have done better? Would they have had better foresight? Wouldn't the prospect of this kind of intervention simply invite politically determined, wasteful decisions? Wouldn't the impact of inevitable mistakes in judgment have been magnified by being imposed on a broader scale? Such policies would inevitably degenerate into attempts to preserve non-competitive industries or to preserve certain politicians. It makes no sense, and it would do much harm to try to maintain any particular economic sector at a particular size. Temporary protection seldom leads to increased competitiveness. More often, it leads to pressures for continued protection, and then pressures to extend subsidies or protection to industries which become non-competitive because of the high prices of the protected industries. Fallacy number 2 is that foreigners have produced the trade deficit through unfair practices and trade barriers to which we have naively acquiesced, and therefore we should protect our own markets in response. Now, there certainly are a great many trade barriers and unfair trading practices abroad, but such barriers don't account for the trade deficit, only for the composition of what is traded. Even their total elimination would do very little, if anything, to eliminate imbalances which are due to macroeconomic forces. Some of the most highly protectionist countries in the world have had trade deficits, and some of the most open economies have had surpluses. Now, that doesn't mean that we should be indifferent to foreign barriers to trade. Such barriers keep us from gaining the full potential advantages of trade. We get only the benefit that comes to us from keeping our markets open, thus being able to buy to our greatest advantage, but we lose the benefit that would come from being able to sell to our greatest advantage. A country that closes its markets impoverishes some of its own people to enrich others of its own people, and in the process it impoverishes some foreigners too. I can tell you from personal experience, including the way I spent an hour this morning, that the U.S. government works hard to reduce barriers to our exports. We do this in both bilateral and multilateral negotiations. There hasn't been much recognition of our successes, though in fact they've been quite significant. We have achieved, for example, significant increases in exports to Japan, which is our largest customer. We have deflected a number of European protectionist measures. We have negotiated a free trade arrangement with Canada. We have succeeded in launching the Uruguay round of multilateral trade negotiations, now underway in Geneva. Our success will not be improved by legislation which puts us into negotiating straitjackets, reducing our discretion as to when and whether we must retaliate to establish our negotiating credibility. If we are forced into retaliatory protectionism, it will not lower the deficit, but only our own standard of living. Especially now, when our competitive strength is making itself felt in rapid growth of exports, we will lose much if we get involved in an escalating series of trade restrictions with our trading partners. The fallacy number 3 is that the U.S. deficit means that we have lost jobs, or at least lost high-paying jobs. Well, clearly such a statement doesn't square with the facts on employment that I cited earlier. In fact, shifting patterns of international trade are reflected in the industrial composition, not the overall level of employment. When an economy is performing well, as ours most definitely is, any jobs lost to import competition will be more than offset by jobs in other industries. Indeed, as I explained earlier, in a strong economy, jobs lost to foreign countries are as much pushed out by other domestic industries competing for their inputs as they are pulled out by foreign competition from their own industry. And finally, we must recognize that the purchasing power of all American workers is increased by the lower priced goods that are made available through trade. Fallacy number 4 is that capital inflows that balance the trade deficit leave us at the mercy of foreign creditors and are resulting in the buildup of net indebtedness to foreigners that will impoverish our children. Greater growth of foreign claims on the United States than of U.S. claims on foreigners is a necessary consequence of net capital inflows. This is often called erroneously an increase in debt, and we are said to be the world's largest debtor, to have lost our influence in the world because of it, and to have mortgaged our future and our children's. That's just poppycock, all of it. Inflows of capital from abroad make our labor and our natural resources more productive instead of the labor and the natural resources of the country from which the capital comes. That is, in fact, the way this country was built. Only part of the capital that comes here results in debt. Much of it is equity. When the Germans build an automobile plant in Pennsylvania, or the Japanese build one in Ohio, paying for it's their responsibility, not ours. It's no debt of ours. Concern is sometimes expressed about the growing burden on U.S. income, represented by the returns of foreigners on their investments. But the product of the additional investment made possible by the capital inflows is greater than the income it will pay to its foreign owners. And moreover, total investment in the United States continues to exceed net capital inflows, so our national net worth continues to grow. And thus we will be able to make these payments while still growing in wealth. A final warning on alarms about foreign debt: don't trust the data. The Department of Commerce, which publishes them, doesn't even label them debt. This is not the time or place to try to elucidate that, but I will toss you 2 tidbits that may enlighten you a little bit if you chew over them. First is that our gold holdings are valued among our assets at $43.22 an ounce, and we have large gold holdings among our assets. And second, in 1987, we received $14.5 billion more income on our assets abroad than we paid to foreigners on their assets here, which is a very paradoxical position for a debtor. Imbalances in international current accounts are not undesirable when they reflect temporary differences between countries' cyclical positions, or when they reflect basic differences between countries in the profitability of investment and the propensity to save. Our present imbalances, however, are largely the result of distorting government policies here and abroad. Abroad, government policies in many countries have created poor climates for investment, so their funds are invested here, thus contributing to the trade imbalance. In the United States, the government deficit probably reduces savings which, had they been left in private hands, would have reduced the imbalances. Our current account deficit also would be reduced if foreign economies were stronger, for then they would import more. Parenthetically, I might say that, of course, our deficit would also be reduced if our economy were weaker, but I don't know anybody that supports that remedy yet. While Japan's economy is growing fairly briskly now, it would benefit from internal structural reforms, basically an exceedingly inefficient economy. European countries need to break down the many structural rigidities that impede growth, employment, and adjustment. In the meantime, market forces are already vigorously at work reducing the international imbalances to the extent that the market judges them to be excessive. This is the meaning of the dollar's decline in the foreign exchange markets. That decline has brought about major changes in the growth of exports and imports. As long as we maintain steady policies, we need not fear a sudden loss of confidence and flight of capital that would cause the dollar to plummet and interest rates to rise. The U.S. is by far the best place in the world to invest, and it's getting even more so. Well, just by way of a quick summary and conclusion, that increasingly around the world, the market is being recognized to be the most successful organizing principle for attaining prosperity and economic growth. Evidence is gradually overcoming ideological doubts. The United States, with an economy that is robust and competitive, has provided the most dramatic evidence. We have a considerable way to go in putting market principles fully into practice ourselves, but now, when we see success all over the world, now is not the time to turn back. Our demonstration is doing more good for the world than could any amount of foreign aid, you can tell Alan Woods I said so, and multinational bank loans, useful as those are. The world economy is definitely going our way.
Mr. Wallis correctly stated that much of the capital inflow in the United States is equity. However, there is also a great deal of ownership, foreign ownership of things such as U.S. Treasury bonds, which I would consider pure debt. And I wanted to know if he felt that this type of debt is a problem or not, and whether he felt that this gave foreign debt holders greater influence over United States policy.
The question, I believe, is whether foreign owned materials or bonds in the United States constitutes a serious form of debt and complicates our general economic circumstances.
Well, I think he asked about bonds and not materials, because materials obviously don't make a problem, but the bonds...
I'm specifically thinking of U.S. Treasury bonds.
Yeah, the Treasury bonds don't make a problem. They're, if anything, been an advantage in keeping interest rates lower than they otherwise would have been. But there would be, if they went way up and up and up, they could become a problem, but not the kind of problem you have in Brazil and Mexico and in the other major debtor countries. Their problems arise because of the fact that their debts are payable in dollars, not pesos or whatever their currency is. Our debts are payable in U.S. dollars, and the Treasury very wisely has resisted strong pressures to issue debt in yen or other currencies, because that would, if that went far enough, it wouldn't, to start with, it wouldn't matter, but if it kept growing and growing, then it might create a serious problem.
Mr. Shapiro?
Secretary, it's a two-part question. The administration has been successful in negotiating two major bilateral agreements, one with Israel and one with Canada. At the same time, the President is resisting this trade bill, which has a great deal of protection in it. My question is, and yet again, the New York Times reported today that the common market is developing certain protectionist tendencies to try to make that a closed market. My question is, as successful as the bilateral agreements have been, why aren't we doing more to beef up GATT and work on multilateral agreements that seem to be more successful and more productive?
I'll repeat that question, and then the Secretary will correct my repeating of the question. I think Mr. Shapiro is simply asking, why don't we place more emphasis upon improving GATT and multilateral agreements?
Well, you're absolutely right, and that is our top priority. We worked very hard beginning in '82 to try to get this new round of multilateral trade negotiations off the ground. We came very close in '82. We were blocked. They had a meeting of the GATT, of all the GATT members, there were 92 or so countries represented, and everybody agreed to launch a new round except the European Community, and all of them would have too, but they require unanimity, and France opposed it. So we came close then. And finally, we got it going about a year ago, more, 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, we got it going at a meeting in Uruguay, which is why it's called the Uruguay Round. The meetings are actually in Geneva. And we agree that multilateral negotiations are by far the best way to do it. We need world rules, kind of law governing trade. However, if we can't get that, then we think free trade areas, such as the one with Canada, the one with Israel isn't very big or very consequential. It is to them. But, well, actually, it isn't turning out to be as much to them as they hoped, but it's not very consequential to us. But the Canada one is a unique situation. There is no economic relation between any two countries anywhere in the world that remotely approximates the magnitude of the relation between the United States and Canada. We often make the mistake of saying, maybe I said this in the speech, that Japan's our largest customer for export. Well, I don't even begin to measure up to Japan, to Canada. Canada is so far overwhelmed that we overlook them. You're not aware that the sun is lighting things up, the light bulb up here. And and then the other point is, we aren't confident about getting the multilateral negotiations satisfactorily completed, so we are doing a little backroom work on what do we do if it collapses. And the point you mentioned about the European community is one that I take very seriously. They deny it. They are aiming to get a common market by 1992. Right now, they've been calling it a common market for a long time, but it does resemble the kind of market we have here in freedom of movement of economic goods and resources around. They're working very hard to bring that about by 1992, but we strongly suspect, or at least a lot of us do individually, it's not an official U.S. government suspicion, we suspect that when they get that, they'll put a great big high wall around it. And we aren't the only ones that think that. If you look at the sudden spurt of applications to come into the EC, from Norway and Austria and Switzerland's talking about it, and Turkey is definitely applying, and Morocco, thinking of moving to Europe or something. At any rate, I think we're not the only people that have that feeling that that's what will happen. So I think you've made some good points there, and we're in complete agreement with you, so that's why I think they're good points. Mr. Rich?
May I ask one question, then have you answer the validity of another? First question I'd like to ask, where have you been? Have you talked to the people in Congress, personally? Because I can't believe anyone could sit here and enjoy this hour or whatever long it was, and not come away with a better and more thorough understanding of what the whole problem is. But have you ever had a crack at those Congress people?
The question is, why hasn't your wisdom had a greater impact on the Congress?
Yes, I certainly do see them fairly frequently. And I'd have to say, I wonder, do you know much about how Congress works?
In other words, it's the raw material you have over there.
No, I wouldn't say it's all due to the stupidity of the Congress. Most of the congressmen know that this bill would be terrible. And that would get me into a longer speech on the politics of the U.S., but we are governed by a tyranny of minorities. I mean, each congressman has been elected by a margin of 5 or 10%, usually. They're running a little higher recently, but with modern technology. And that means that he's got to satisfy, I mean, he can't take a chance on alienating 10% of the people if he wants to go back to Washington. And consequently, they dominate. Now, of course, different groups dominate different congressmen, so they wouldn't be able to get anything done. They have to get together and form coalitions. I mean, I'll get A for you that suits your constituents if you'll get me B that doesn't matter to mine but does to yours. And that's quite an art to put those deals together, because you put in A and B and you find out they make you unacceptable to D that you want to go to next. So you've got to think it through to put through the deal. But it's strictly a matter of deals, and that's the way the Congress inherent in the way it works. So they're not, I'd say they're not anything like as stupid as people sometimes like to make them out to be. I try to think, but I met one, I guess, that I think is pretty dumb. But, but for the most part, even if they don't agree with me, they're not dumb.
Well, the other thing I wanted you to verify, I'm not positive of this, I think it was in the our good Sun. They put out the argumentation that Russia, as a nation, can go to the banks and get their loans at cost of money to the bank plus 1/7 of 1% interest to them. Now, and that's to Russia. How about our people in our industry? They go in and the best they can get is prime, and the real top one is so many points, maybe a couple of points below prime. But is there any validity to that statement? 1/7, is that a ideal?
Not that I know of, but could be without my knowing it. Let me say first, the Soviets are very, very chary about borrowing. I spent a week over there 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I talked to them about why are they so desperately eager to have all these joint ventures. There's no more complicated way to do business than an international joint venture. Well, it comes out, not when you talk to the officials, but when you talk to the brain trust side of the organization, it's because they don't want to borrow, and they hope that these joint venture partners will bring in capital along with technology and managerial know-how. Now, you probably noticed in today's paper, they just borrowed $2.1 billion from the Germans. There's a lot of curiosity to know what the interest rate was there. But the interest rate that the bank lends is going to depend on its appraisal of the risk. They think they're going to get their money back in a short time, and they're certain of it, they'll take a pretty small margin. If they think it's highly problematical, which is what they think when we were asking about Latin America, then they want a big margin.
Well, am I correct in my personal thinking that they have basically 2 ways of getting the hard currency? Is their gold resources and oil. Oil's really down the pool. We won't sell them the equipment to get it out again. So I think they're mostly on the hard gold, and they only have a finite amount of that. And Gorbachev, with this ambition of his, I don't know how he's going to finance it, but am I basically on the right path on that?
Well, in the long run, I think that they want to join the world, which appears to be the case, that in the long run they could be a viable economy. In the short run,
they're broke.
They've got major problems. Beginning with Gorbachev's visit in December, we've had a string of the top economists visiting us. And they make interesting remarks. They're informal, they're pleasant to deal with, and informed and able. But they make occasionally fascinating informal remarks. One of them, after listening to us try to give him advice for a while, said, "You people don't even begin to understand the magnitude of our problems. Our people don't work. They don't know how to work. They never have worked.
Never heard of the word.
And our people wouldn't know a good consumer's product if they saw one." And they have a major problem. One of their major problems currently is incentives. When I went over there, I took them a stack of Sears Roebuck catalogs and suggested that might be the solution. I was interested to note that this new loan is to produce consumers' goods. You know, people aren't going to work for rubles, and they aren't going to work for dollars either, unless you can buy something with the rubles or the dollars. They'll work for what you can buy. And they've run into that, and it's a very serious problem there.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. How much direct input does the president have on economic policy in the Senate?
You may use your crystal ball.
Topic of the day. How much direct influence does the President of the United States have on economic policy?
Well, he has a lot. I've worked there under other presidents. He has a lot more than any of the others that I've worked with had. That's basically because he personally has been interested in it. After all, that was his campaign platforms that got him elected were largely economic platforms. And the way he works with the economists is he has a breakfast every Monday, I think it is, with the White House staff, which includes the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. And then he meets with the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors alone, either every week or every 2 weeks. It's theoretically every one, but with the way Washington goes, it probably averages out every 2. In addition to that, the cabinet is divided into basically sub-cabinets, cabinet council. There's the cabinet council on economic policy, and of which he's the chairman. Mostly when we meet, he doesn't come because we're mostly thrashing out alternatives and formulating recommendations or rejecting other people's recommendations. But then when the work comes up to a definite decision to be made, then they have a meeting with the president. And typically he doesn't give a decision right then and there. Occasionally he does. Goes off and thinks about it.
Yes, sir.
Yes, we hear a lot about third world debt and its effect on the U.S. and the international banking system. Haven't heard much recently. Does that mean the problem's solved? Or is there still a great risk here? Could that system withstand the default of, say, of Brazil, Poland, or Mexico?
Well, I think the answer.
You hear the question?
Oh, yeah.
What's your observation, or what would be your observation about the impact of third world debt today?
Assuming that somebody would ask about that, I saw one figure, and the only issue is whether I can find them now. But here we are. Certainly the problem isn't solved, but depending on how you define solved, that is, it's on the way to solution. It's being reduced considerably, and progress is being made. Of the 15 major debtor countries, which on the average had a declining rate of growth of about 3% as of 1985, now their rate of growth is averaging 3% plus. And that's what they need, is to have their economy producing something. And they can, Korea has had one of the biggest debts among the countries, and nobody worries about them because they have an active, productive economy. And I have a lot of figures on different countries if you're interested in them. But I think the answer basically is, some of the banks here, I think, are certainly, well, some of them have taken a big loss already. And for the most part, they've probably taken virtually all of the loss that they'll incur, the big ones, because whatever the banking authorities say, the market's not stupid. And they know which banks have which loans, and they write down the value of the stock if they think it's not likely to pay off. The banking authorities result in official figures that may not show that.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask a question about the federal indebtedness. You painted a very glowing picture of reduced unemployment, increased productivity, some of the other things. Is it not a fact that that progress has been fueled by the most astronomical increase in debt that the United States has ever seen? In the last 2 terms of the presidency, we've accumulated more debt as a nation than we accumulated in the total life of the nation before that. And it seems to me, as an amateur in the field, that at some point this is self-defeating. The constant borrowing to pay for the economic expansion, at some point we do, like Brazil or other countries, we have a massive devaluation of the dollar, and in the long run, is that going to be a healthy balance overall of the loss of equity through the devaluation of the dollar, of the increasing debt burden, a higher percentage of our taxes going to maintain the indebtedness that we've incurred in these last 10 years?
Would you comment upon the dangers of the indebtedness which we've incurred over the past decade?
Yes, and he's talking now not about the debt I talked about earlier that people drum up all the hysteria about, but by the actual debt of the U.S. Treasury, which is just under $2 trillion, or what you'll see published is just under $2.5 trillion. But $0.5 trillion of that is owned by the government itself. So there's $2 trillion that it owes to non-governmental sources. And that is and it isn't a problem. At that magnitude, and with an economy of our size, we're going to have toward $4 to $5 trillion a year. That's not not disproportionately large compared to our historical experience to carry. But if it keeps growing, it will get to be pretty soon. Though as long as it grows less fast than the economy grows, our capacity to carry it will still be improving. But I think that the federal debt is by far the biggest problem we have, and not the debt itself, but the deficit in annual budgets that create that debt and make it grow. Those deficits also, if you look at it strictly from an economic point of view, they aren't doing any harm either at the level of magnitude at which they're running. Might be better if they weren't, but the real catch is that there is no control over the level of government spending unless you think the budget has to be balanced. If you come up with some mystic number like a deficit of 4.7% of GNP would be all right, but 4.8 wouldn't, or anything like that, it simply won't work. You depend on the morale that the budget has to be, the expenditures and income have to be approximately equal every year, at least over a 2 or 3 year period. If you don't have that, you have the sort of thing we have now. People come in to us and say, you won't give us a measly $40 million for an opera house in Rattlesnake County, South Dakota. What kind of Philistines are you? Out of a deficit of $150 billion, you won't put up a measly $40 million? And we got flooded with those things and that kind of argument. And then the State Department will be going, you mean to say you're telling us to close the consulate in Stuttgart just to save $10 million a year? Or whatever it may be. Within the government you get that too. So unless you have this balance, that deficit is thrown in your face every time you try to tell somebody the government can't support everything under the sun. Now with the deficit, I don't think it's the deficit that's the problem. It's having the government use up the resources. It doesn't matter if they use them up, whether they did it by borrowing, by inflating, or taxing. The key point is the resources that could have produced something useful and probably produced almost nothing now. The government took them, and very little has been produced. And as I say, that's the fact. The government uses the physical resources and manpower and all. It's gone, and it keeps the economy from growing and keeps people from being as prosperous as they otherwise could be. So I don't put so much attention on the deficit as on expenditures. The thing that we've got to learn to control is the level of government expenditures. And the deficit has resulted from expenditures getting out of hand, not from the receipts going down. The receipts have gone up as a percentage of GNP. They did come down last year, incidentally. But, not a negligible drop, but not a big one either. But it's expenditures as a proportion of GNP that's been going up and up and up. And it's not defense expenditures either. They've been pretty stable for the last 3 to 4 years. 6.5% of GNP.
Sir, we're only going to have time for 2 more questions. And you, sir, I think were next, and then you, ma'am. Those will be the last 2.
I would suggest that Korea is about 30 years behind Japan in terms of their rather fantastic growth. And also that there's been a lot of criticism of our handling of Japan during their growth period. Would you suggest any new techniques of handling Korea to help control the imbalance of trade?
Can we learn from our experience with Japan in better controlling our potential problems in trade with Korea?
Well, imbalances with any given country are not a problem. It's in the aggregate and sustained may become a problem, and even that doesn't necessarily. This country, throughout the last part of the 19th century and up until the First World War, ran a deficit because so much capital was coming in here from elsewhere. But with regard to Japan, let me make a point that somehow gets overlooked. The economic growth of Japan in the last 25 years has been enormously valuable to the United States economically. We're now able to get a lot more with our income than we were before. We've got them producing a lot of stuff that we used to produce ourselves, and we've gone to producing higher grade things. And the trade between the U.S. and Japan is somewhat illusory. I was in Japan about 3 weeks ago, and I had a day extra, and since we were having a big row with them about beef, and also some about electronics, I went up to a town about 300 miles north of Tokyo, where in the morning I visited 2 beef factories, farms, and in the afternoon an electronics plant. They, in the electronics plant, they're making compact disc players, and beautiful plant. Everything's going marvelously. Very high technology equipment making this stuff and so on. And some was being made for the U.S. and some for Europe and maybe some from Japan for all I know. Then they took us into the rooms where they do their research and design and development and so on, and it was full of millions of dollars worth of U.S. equipment. Computers, computer-assisted design equipment, some of it I'd never seen before. And take the telephone business, if you've got a phone on your desk, it might be Japanese. If you've got one at home, it's more likely to be Japanese. On the other hand, in Japan, they buy $5 million switches from us. They order the big, complicated central exchanges. They don't order all of them from us. They make some and buy some from Ericsson and the European producers. But there's a specialization there that we're, again, on semiconductors. The memory chips, they make, that's a bulk commodity, and they make them in huge quantity. The logic chips, we still dominate. There's a difference there, too. And there's getting to be a specialization. Now, they also have had a very, very restrictive trade policy, and they're basically culturally protective. And they're gradually being shaken out of it. The fact that we're selling that telecommunications equipment, like those large switching equipment that I just mentioned, that's the result of a major battle we had with them back about 1985 and into 86 to get them to open up their telecommunications market and let our people in. And incidentally, they have all kinds of subtle ways. They'll write specifications, and it says it's to have this and that type of resistor, whatever a resistor is. But then you talk to an expert, and he tells you, well, they don't make that type in Japan, but here's a type made in other countries that work just as well. So whoever wrote the specification knew perfectly well what he was doing. And there's a lot of that. Now, there's more of that in Korea. Korea is far more protectionist. We recently got them to take down they had a law that if you'd be arrested if you smoked a foreign cigarette. And they rescinded that, but they haven't really opened up their market. But they're doing some. They don't let the insurance business do any business over there, except they've begun to let it do a little. And the problem there is very complicated because of the political situation. One thing we care about is political stability there. That's extremely important to our national security, independent from our economic security. And all of these restrictionist, protectionist policies everywhere are due to popular feeling. What are the problems that are referred to as international economic problems, without exception, are domestic political problems. Why are they resisting us so much on beef and citrus? Well, because the beef farmers and the citrus growers are located in certain strategic places, and they support the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, very generously. Why are we raising such a fuss about it? Well, because there's some orange growers in Florida and California that also have a lot of political clout here. And so all these problems, when you get behind them, turn out to be domestic politics, and they conflict in the two countries. So Korea, I think, is coming along, and the Japanese are beginning to feel the same way about them that we used to feel about the Japanese.
This is the last question.
Secretary Wallis, if the economies of Central and South America do not grow at the desired rate to work themselves out of debt, and these countries are reduced to paying interest only and face a future of indentured servitude with no end, do you have some other strategies to take care of this situation?
Do you believe that the countries of South and Central America might be reduced to paying interest only and becoming, in effect, indentured servants? And if so, do you have alternative strategies?
they're nothing resembling indentured service. They borrowed this money, they wasted it. They didn't put it to productive use. If they had, it would be generating income with which they could pay back their debt and pocket some more, which is what we do with the money we borrow abroad. And they have dug themselves into a hole. Now, we have an interest in seeing them get dug out of that hole, whether it's their fault or not. And ever since the 1983 summit at Williamsburg, 7 major industrial countries have been dealing with this problem. They put out a program there, which has subsequently been elaborated as the Baker Plan. And the first thing it recognizes is that all those countries are different. No generalization applies to 2 of them, practically not to 2, and certainly not to the group. There are 15 worst most serious problems, certainly not to the whole group. The second point, as first one to deal with them one by one. Second point is they've got to make basic changes in their own economic policy. Otherwise, they're going down the tubes, no matter how much money people put in there. We run into that problem sometimes domestically with individuals and so forth. Now that's difficult, and what happens there is that the IMF particularly, and the World Bank too, do 2 things. They go in and send advisors, generally better not to send American advisors because they regard us as imperialists and so on. They send advisors who help them work out the right program. And they also put in money to bridge the gap between when they start. If they really commit themselves to the program, there'll be a period when, if anything, things get worse. As I said in my talk, if you disinflate, you'll have a period of depression right afterwards. You have to work your way out of it. So the IMF and the World Bank put up loans to cover this period. And sometimes the U.S. gets involved in helping a little bit on that, but normally not on that kind. Then, once they get it set up that way, then they put in money on a more permanent basis, and they get the banks to, they talk about putting in new money. Often they merely extend the period on what's already owed them. That is, they claim they collected what was owed, they put it back. And so there's not a whole lot of new money really closed in that way. And the U.S. government puts money in through both aid and our economic support fund. Although, as Alan Woods will probably tell you, we don't have any more money for that now.
Mr. Wallis, I was wondering if you would ever consider, or the government would ever consider total forgiveness of debt in desperate circumstances. I am aware of all these things that we have done, but in case they don't work.
Well, that would be a bailout for the banks here. We don't think it would be politically popular, and we also think it would be completely unsound. The banks went in there and got high interest rates. They knew the risk. They charged high interest rates to cover them. I don't know whether in the net, some of them probably lost money, and some of them in the net may have gained. But in any event, any bailout like that will wind up, and all the proposals you hear are all proposals to transfer the bank risks to the government, the public purse.
Mr. Secretary, I think this has been a special evening for us. We thank you very much for your generosity in spending so much time with us. We hope you'll be back to Baltimore often again. Thank you.